So, perfect. Thank you for starting the recording. So, everybody, please pay attention. The meeting is recorded. And welcome, welcome, welcome to our season 3, episode 3 of VOILA seminars. I'll just now start my sharing of my screen. So, do you see the slides now?
Yes, very well.
Yeah. Perfect. So today we welcome you for our third episode of third season on the topic of brains beyond computers, and we are delighted to have Professor Romain Brette from the Institute of Intelligent Systems and Robotics in Paris. So thank you for agreeing to our invitation. And I will now introduce briefly the speaker of today's talk and a couple of discussions that we're also lucky to have today. And then I will give a bit of an overview how the next 1.5 hours will go, and we can proceed with the talk. So without further ado, again, thanks, Romain, for joining us today. Romain is a research director in computational and theoretical neuroscience in the Institute of Intelligent Systems and Robotics. Before he studied and worked in UK, Canada, and France, so a very international background. And actually, I was the person who invited or who initiated the invitation for this talk because I had the chance to listen to Romain's talk at the University of Sussex. It was online and actually around the COVID time. He was talking about metaphor, brain-computer metaphor, and in general, whether brain is the brain's mode of processing is a calculation or computation or algorithmic at all. And he was discussing alternative modes of how brain is actually functioning. It's a reduced version of what he was talking about and very simplified. But in general, so for the broader audience, that's kind of summary. Romain will talk about that more, I suppose, today. And I'm very looking forward to today's talk because I think it's a natural continuation of what I've heard before with probably more elaborations. And I'm very fascinated with the topic, and I hope you will share the same fascination as well. And find something interesting for everybody from different backgrounds of sciences. So, Romain, please, when it will be your turn to start, please feel free to mention any of your current interests and ongoing work, so participants can find the link with you and reach out if they do something similar or complementary to what you are doing. And I'm sure there are plenty of people who actually can be interested in research, your ongoing research. Our two discussants today, who also are for sure need to be mentioned, one is Professor Ingrid Betus. Oh, sorry, Ingrid, if I mispronounce your surname, please correct me later. She's a full professor, neuroscientist at Institute of Molecular and Cellular Pharmacology, lecturer, researcher, and the director of Modeling and Neuronal and Cognitive Systems Master Program. So thanks, Ingrid. We're very delighted to have you as well as our discussant. Second discussant is Simone Vannuccini, bringing another perspective of a social scientist. He is a chair of economics and of artificial intelligence and innovation at University Côte d'Azur and Grideg Laboratory. He is also co-organizer of VOILA seminars together with our wonderful affiliate team who are also here today presented. So thanks everybody for joining us today. And a little bit of guidelines for the next, for the remaining session. Speaker will have 40-45 minutes to talk. Then following up a quick session of questions and answers from the audience. A couple of questions, just something immediate thoughts after. Then discussants will provide their discussions. I suppose give or take for 10 minutes each, but let's see how much we will be in time. So maybe we will have a little bit more, a little bit less, and then open discussion for everybody and comments and questions. During the talk, if speakers, all of them, discussants including, agree for the recording, Romain already kindly agreed to that. Also, please keep in mind that there is a real-time translation available with subtitles of the language of your choice, and you can always post questions in the chat, which we will attend to in a dynamic way. So I suppose the floor is yours, Romain. Thanks again, and we're looking forward to your talk.
Thank you. Okay, so let me share the screen now. Is that working? Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you for the invitation and for this opportunity to speak maybe to a different crowd than the one I'm used to. So the idea that brains are some sort of computers is something that we read or hear, that we read in the press very often. Like the brain processes information, it runs algorithms, and so on. So this is something that is very familiar. And it is even more familiar now that we have computers that can do things that normally humans do with artificial intelligence algorithms. This, in fact, is not just in the mainstream media, like in a popular audience, but also in the scientific literature, not just in the machine learning community, but also in the biological community in neuroscience. It's very common to read things like that neurons compute and so on. But what is rarely done in that scientific literature is a critical examination of the concept, of this concept, that the idea that neurons compute. It's just stated usually as a matter of fact, and then we ask how, not whether, neurons compute. And so this is basically what I want to talk about. Does this concept make sense when we talk about what brains do? And this analogy between brains and computer is something that runs in the literature in computer science also, not just in neuroscience, has been running since the beginning, actually, of modern computers. It is, as you will see now. So in theories of the brain, there have been two main branches, which are two views of the brain as computer, in fact. One is classical computationalism. And in classical computationalism, which is at the root of cognitive science, cognition is seen as some form of computation, that is the manipulation of symbols with algorithms. And this was developed from the 1940s. And in the artificial intelligence community, it gave rise to what is now called GOFI, for good old-fashioned artificial intelligence. And that refers to a set of engineering techniques that uses logical rules on symbols, like expert systems. And at the time, so that was up to the 1980s, at the time, this this type of artificial intelligence work had some success, but also already at the time, some people, like what you see here is a book by Herbert Dreyfus, who was a philosopher, who wrote What Computers Can Do. I think that was in the 1970s, where he explained that it was a criticism of expert systems and this kind of techniques. He explained that in fact, it is beginners, not experts, that use rules. Rules are used to train people to do some stuff, like in medicine, for example. But then but it's really a guide. When they become skilled, what they do very often is to ignore rules. Rules are for beginners. This is what he argued then. But at the time, that was very unpopular within the artificial intelligence community, and it was dismissed. But just a few years later, maybe a decade later, good old-fashioned artificial intelligence was essentially abandoned. And after that, in fact, intermingled with that, there was another stream of artificial intelligence called connectionism. And in connectionism, cognition arises not exactly about the manipulation of symbols, but rather from the interaction of mini neurons, quote, which are seen as stereotypical components, like electronic components, like an AND gate, for example, input-output devices. So connectionism also has many similarities with computationalism. And in fact, as I will explain, the history of those two types of theories is really intermingled. The illustration that you see here is the first connectionist model called the perceptron, which was introduced by Rosenblatt in the 50s. And so this connectionist networks, which features so-called neurons, is what is at the base now of modern artificial intelligence algorithm, which use artificial neural models. And for example, deep learning models. And those models are based on a pioneer model made in the 1940s, 1943, by McCulloch and Pitts. And the idea of that model, it was really simple model of a binary neuron. A neuron was seen as something that can be on or off, and that represented the activity of a neuron. This was inspired by the fact that actual neurons in the brain can produce or spike or not. And the activity in the model of the neuron, seen really as zeros or ones, was seen as a function of its inputs, which are also binary, through a function that is very simple, just a linear function. You just sum everything with some weights, and when it exceeds some threshold, then the output is 1, otherwise it's 0. So that's called the McCulloch and Pitts neurons, and what you find now in modern neurons is really a tiny variation around that idea. Now, of course, this is a drastic simplification of what a neuron does. So here I'm showing a recording which dates from the 1950s, a recording of a voltage trace in vivo in an actual neuron of a cat, anesthetized. I think this comes from the primary visual cortex of a cat looking at visual gratings. I'll just play it again. What you see here is some electrical activity which is highly fluctuating, very dynamic, and then sometimes you have this electrical spikes, which are called action potentials. And now, of course, that is a bit different from the McCulloch and Pitts model. And in fact, although this model is sometimes in textbooks, especially in computational neuroscience textbooks, sometimes depicted as the primary, like the first model neuron, like a simple model that would have been then refined, that is not actually the case. It is not a simple model that was refined. It is, on the contrary, the result of a drastic simplification of previous models, which were much more sophisticated. And for example, in the 1930s, there were mathematical models of neurons which were very similar with summation, integration, excitation, inhibition, and so on. But those were dynamical models because they were meant really as models to understand the dynamics of neural activity. It is dynamic. And those took the form of differential equations well before McCulloch and Pitts proposed their model. The real innovation in that model was precisely to discard time. If you discard time and you make the activity just binary, then what you get is just a function. It's a function of inputs which are binary, and a function of inputs that are binary is a logical operation. That was the innovation. What McCulloch and Pitts had in mind was really computationalism, the idea that what the mind was about was the manipulation, logical manipulation of symbols. And that was what their model was about, a drastic simplification of what we thought of neurons in order to fit the idea of the mind as symbolic manipulation. And so once you discard time, you have logical calculus, and that is why their paper was entitled A Logical Calculus of the Ideas Immanent in Nervous Activity. Okay, so there you have a domain in which the model operates, which is not anymore a biophysical domain, but the domain of logics. And with this model, we bring neurons into classical computationalism, a domain of symbols. Now, later on, this same model was used in a completely different way by Rosenblatt in the 1950s, 1958, with a model that he called the perceptron. What he was interested in was not a logical proposition, but things like recognition of images, things that you could not easily describe in logical terms. So the input was not logical symbols anymore, it was the intensity of pixels. The output was maybe the recognition of some pattern of pixels. And the weights that you have in the model, that is also one crucial factor in Rosenblatt's perceptron. Those weights were tuned by association between inputs and outputs. And this brought McCulloch and Pitt's model into a completely different philosophical realm, which is in fact closer to behaviorism than to computationalism. This is something that McCulloch and Pitt did not like at all. He really disagreed with this view. And other computationalists like Minsky, a decade later, made a lot of effort to show that with the perceptron, with this kind of model, you couldn't do anything useful. And then the perceptron was abandoned for several decades. Yeah, this is an illustration that comes from that paper. Now, in both cases, we have two, in fact, philosophically quite different views on the mind, but they share something similar, which is the idea of seeing neurons as some kind of stereotypical input-output components that is formally specified. It could be binary or it could be graded. The weights could be tuned or not. It could represent propositions or intensities of pixels, but in any case, it's some kind of transistor, some kind of gate. And in fact, when you look now at the history not of neuroscience and artificial intelligence, but the history of computers, a few years later, in 1945, John von Neumann described the architecture of the modern electronic computer. And that paper, or that report, in fact, you see many mentions to McCulloch and Pitt's binary model. He was very inspired by that because that model was precisely a model of calculation. So that's what he used. Now, what a neuron is in all those approaches is a formally specified input-output operation like you have in electronic components. It's a specific operation that you can write mathematically. Now, you need, in fact, this formal specification in all branches of artificial intelligence, as well as in many theories that you find now in computational neuroscience. For example, if you think of the brain as a set of hardwired circuits, that's what people sometimes describe to talk about instincts. So hardwired circuits that would perhaps be specified in the genome. Well, in order to think of neurons like that, you need neurons to be specified components with the specification being somewhere. Now, if you look at modern artificial intelligence, the key to the success of convolutional networks, for example, of large language models, is what we call automatic differentiation. And the idea of automatic differentiation is that when you have a function of a lot of parameters, which is what an artificial neural network is, you have lots of parameters, and you define an error criterion, you want to minimize it. Well, the best way to do this is to use optimization algorithm that uses the differentiation of the function. That is the derivative of the function with respect to the parameters that you want to tune. And to do that, we have now engineering techniques that differentiate the operations so that it can do gradient descent, which is an algorithm to tune those parameters. But in order to do that, you need to have a formal specification of those operations. So this formal specification is something that is really crucial in the way modern artificial intelligence works. So this is a feature of those models that is necessary, but as I will argue, that does not exist in brains. Now, connectionism is something that does not belong to artificial intelligence, not only, but also more broadly to brain theory. And in fact, it is very active and alive in modern theory in neuroscience. So recently, to the point that recently, people have argued that, well, in order to understand the brain, what we need to do is to measure the connections between neurons, because if neurons are stereotypical elements, what really determines what the brain does is how they are wired. And now there are techniques to do that. What you see here is an illustration, which is, well, it's not an illustration, it's really a microscopy image, which shows genetically colored neurons, and that is used to segment anatomical images so that you can get and measure wiring diagrams between neurons. And you can see in a fairly recent review that argues about the development of this kind of techniques, this kind of claims. It might not be so unrealistic to hope that in staring into such a map, the map of connections, we might get a glimpse of the human mind. Now, this seems a bit grandiose, but really that is just an expression of connectionism. If you know the map, you know everything there is to know. And there was also this TED talk by Sebastian Sung, where he explains to the audience that what you are really is nothing else than the set of connections in your brains. That, again, sounds a bit grandiose and maybe extreme, but it's not extreme. It's just the expression of radical connectionism. If indeed cognition is just determined by the wiring between components, then yes, once you have the wiring, you have memory, you have the mind. But how did it fare? Well, the fact is that even though artificial intelligence had quite a number of successes recently, empirically, in terms of understanding how the brain works, how did connectionism really work? Well, the fact is that since the 1980s, we know from the scientific literature that connectomes do not determine cognition. We know that because since the 1980s, we have had the connectomes of the connectome in particular of C. elegans, which is a microscopic, well, millimeter size worm. And in the 1980s, a number of scientists have started to be interested in that worm because it has one of the smallest nervous system among all animals with about 300 neurons. And so in the 1980s, scientists managed to make a complete map of the connections of all the neurons with names of individual neurons. So we've had this map for a long time. But do we understand how this nervous system works? Certainly not. We understand the neuroanatomy. We understand a number of things. We don't understand how it shapes the behavior of this little worm. And to the point that in that same review paper, opinion paper that I mentioned, the authors, while advocating for the development of connectomics, had to admit the following thing, that the worm connectome may not be as useful as initially imagined because of its surprising complexity. Yes, but for some reason that didn't really shake the beliefs that in connectionism. We have also known and had a lot of detailed technical information about connectomes of subsystems, in particular in invertebrates, such as the crustacean stomatogastric ganglion. And this is the subsystem that is shared between a number of invertebrates, and it's quite stereotypical. And we know a lot of things about this in the invertebrate neuroscience community, which is certainly not the mainstream community. And what we've learned from this stream of studies is that, well, this same structure can actually have many different functions depending on the species, but also in the same species, depending on what the animal is doing, and in particular, related to neuromodulation. So in addition to connections, in the nervous system, you have much more complexity, some that go through modulation of synapses, and some that do not even go through synapses, like, for example, with gas, like like NO gas. And what is known is that basically it's much more complicated than the connectome. The connectome, in any case, does not determine cognition or behavior. This is something that we have been known for a long time, in fact. But this is usually played down. So what is missing? Why is it that once we have the connection between the neurons, we don't have everything? Well, there is something that is really striking, the elephant in the room, if you wish, in those theories about the brain, the mainstream theories about the brain, which are computational, is that biology plays essentially no role. The fact that the brain is a living tissue, in particular, plays absolutely no theoretical role. It doesn't matter. To the point that there's this famous philosopher of mine, Hilary Putnam, who was very influential in cognitive science, who explained that cognition is independent of matter. He put it in these terms: we could be made of Swiss cheese and it wouldn't matter. That is to say, how computation is realized in the brain doesn't matter. It doesn't matter that it's a brain or a set of transistors or indeed Swiss cheese. That is the mainstream doctrine in cognitive science still today. And the idea essentially is that biology is implementation. The result of that is that scientists in cognitive science in general are largely ignorant of biology. Of course, in the great climbs, they have heard about evolutions and neurons and so on, but in details, in particular, the theory of biology is something that is very niche to many of the mainstream cognitive scientists and indeed computational neuroscientists. So what I want to tell you about now is a few, I think, important facts about life that might matter when we talk about cognition. Now, what is life and what is a living organism? Well, the consensus now that has been developing since, I would say, the 1970s, 60s, 70s, which is, by the way, well after the cybernetic revolution in the 1940s and 50s. So things that people did not know at the time. Well, what is the consensus now is that a living organism is an organization of processes that somehow maintains itself out of thermodynamic equilibrium. And what does that mean? Well, what we know now is that living matter is made of molecules, organic molecules, many of which are proteins, and those molecules are in fact transient, unlike a computer or any kind of artifact made by man or a rock. The material constituent of a living organism is not stable. So, for example, what you're seeing here is the distribution of half-life of proteins in a hippocampal slice, so a piece of brain of mice, and this half-life is around a week. So in 2 weeks, the entire material content of this piece of brain, of the hippocampus, which is involved in memories, in 2 weeks, this is entirely renewed. All the molecules, at least all the protein content, is completely new. Okay, yet you still have memories. And what happens is that those proteins are being remade continuously and degraded as well, actively, by the system itself. And this idea of circularity has been popularized in the 1970s under the name autopoiesis, which means basically self-production, by Francisco Varela and Umberto Maturana. And then, as you see here, there's a stream also of theoretical biologists who have developed similar concepts, some of them independently. So how are proteins made in the cell? They are made particular from the genome, but they are made with the help of molecules called enzymes, which catalyze reactions. And enzymes, what are they? Enzymes are proteins. So enzymes are also made by catalytic reaction from other enzymes. So this forms a circular organization which continuously makes itself. And in order for this to work, you need a constant influx of energy. In other words, a living organism needs to feed. And so living organisms are very particular kinds of physical objects that are not at equilibrium. What is at equilibrium is a dead organism, not a living organism. This idea in the theoretical biology literature has been evolving and has been along different lines. What you see here is a recent extension of this idea of circular organization, with the idea that the organism is a closed organization of constraints. The enzyme, for example, is a constraint of what kind of reactions are made, and those constraints are made by the system itself. But there are other constraints like the vascular network, if you think about it, which constrains the way the blood circulates in the organism and so on. One of the key implications of this is that in a living organism, in a brain, for example, there is no such thing as hardware. There is no material stability. Everything is soft. So in connectionism, synaptic weights can be tuned, but in the brain, it's not just synapses that change, it's everything else, the shape of neurons, every piece of membrane. All of this actually changes. It's nothing like an electronic component. One implication of this, as I will discuss more, is that there cannot be any formal specification of what a neuron is, because it's a dynamic entity. Now, the theoretical biology literature has focused mainly on cells, but we are not just one cell, we are multicellular organisms. And where do we come from? It's useful to discuss where we come from in evolution. What you see here is what is often referred to as the tree of life, although now we know that it's not exactly a tree. I will mention that briefly. What I want to point out here is that 1.5 billion years ago, our ancestors, which are the same ancestors as plants and also mushrooms, our ancestors were unicellular organism called the last eukaryotic common ancestor, LECA. That was 1.5 billion years ago, and those looked like this, probably. That is what is inferred from modern genomic studies. This was a marine protist, that is a microbe, unicellular organism with a flagellum that swam in the sea. And probably its in fact, shared with our own cells, including neurons, many similarities, structural and genomic similarities. The organelles, you see, for example, the mitochondrion, the nucleus, and so on. That was 1.5 billion years ago. And so what happened then? Well, actually, an interesting, I think, point also that not so many people know, where do these organelles come from? Well, what is not so well known, but what I think is quite important, is that these things did not evolve in the sense that they progressively, evolve from mutations. This is not what happened at all. What happened is a phenomenon that's called endosymbiosis, that was argued by Lynn Margulis in the 1960s and proved in the 70s. So endosymbiosis is a phenomenon where freely living organisms are engulfed into other organisms and then belong part of this host and reproduce with it. So the mitochondria, for example, which are referred to in textbooks as the power plants of cells, are actually, once upon a time, were actually freely living bacteria, which you actually find also in nature outside of cells nowadays in a different form, obviously. And same for chloroplasts of plants that provide energy, and the green color to plant, they came from cyanobacteria, which you see in lakes also now. And you also have phenomenon of endosymbiosis at a higher level. For example, this is a ciliate, so an eukaryote, which hosts in itself alga, which is itself an eukaryote, which in itself has chloroplasts. So what is interesting here is that it makes the point that already a single cell, the cell itself, is more like an ecosystem, like a machine. It's something that has little beasts inside it that reproduces with it. In fact, for example, it's well known that mitochondria have their own DNA and they divide within the cell. It's really quite different from a plant or a factory. And how did we go from there to animals? Well, this remains a matter of ongoing research, but what is believed is that you have unicellular animals which a few 100 million years ago lived in colonies, and sometimes these colonies got together, stuck to each other, and depending on situations, and then parted away. And then that evolved in some lines, biological lines, into what was optional sedentary to obligatory multicellular phases. So what that means is that an animal is essentially a colony of protists that has settled. Okay, when you think about cells, about neurons, the image that you should have in mind is not something like a transistor or logical gate. It's more something like a little living entity that lives within your brain, within your organism. Okay, and this you see quite obviously in animal development, because animals develop not by assembling components, but by division of a single cell into the organism. Okay. And so what an animal is a developing colony of cells that builds the body, which is a sort of house, which also has, by the way, usually some associated symbiotic species, like the gut microbiota or microbes on the skin and so on. That is what an animal is, okay? Now, this process of development, I want to stress that, is nothing like the assembly of components from a plan. It is sometimes said that the genome is a sort of plan where, for example, you have hardwired circuits in the brain that are specified in the genome. That is very misleading. there is some level of reproducibility, mainly because development, well, a lot of the development occurs in an enclosed space outside of encapsulated from the outside environment, and so the same conditions trigger the same results. But if something occurs during development, as you see in this example, then the animal will develop in a different way. So it's not a determinism of the genome, it's rather a determinism of the conditions in which the genome constrains development. So for example, in this example, it's just a case study, a medical case study of a young woman who, for some completely independent reason, did an MRI. In this MRI scan of the brain, scientists noticed something very bizarre, and that she had only one hemisphere of the brain. Nobody noticed that before, and she could see more or less normally, maybe some minor impairment of vision. But that is quite surprising when you know from neuroanatomy textbooks that there is a wiring from each eye to the brain in a very stereotypical way between people, usually, where each hemifield of the eye projects to the contralateral hemisphere in the brain. And then that is how brain areas are organized. But she had only one hemisphere. So what happened there, and what they could notice, is that, in fact, both hemifields of each eye projected to the same hemisphere, and then she could see almost normally. So this process of development is not something that is hardwired. It is not, there is no pre-existing map. There are accidents, and then just development occurs in a different way. So it's really quite different from how a machine is assembled. Now to the questions of the stock. Do brains compute? So what does it mean that brains compute? The classical theoretical framework to think about this question is a variation along these lines. You have the neural domain, things that you can measure in neurons, like the activity of neurons, the state S of a neuron. And then you want to relate that to some computation. To do that, you say that the state, the activity of some neuron encodes something, like the color of some patch of a visual field, like the color red. And so there is a mapping from the activity of some neuron or some brain region to a formal domain, which is symbolic domain of colors, for example, or the domain of numbers. And then you say that brains implement a computation if the way brain states change through brain processes, well, when it is mapped to the formal domain, correspond to a computation in that formal domain. So, for example, you would say that some brain area encodes an integer or a set of integers, and then this states are changed by brain processes in such a way as to implement addition. Okay. Now, the question that is usually not asked is, are these two things, symbols and neural states, of the same kind, that you could put an arrow between them? Now, to answer this question, I think it's useful to take an actual simple example of a computation. What do we mean by computation? So what kind of computation are we talking about? Well, the kind of computation that people have been trying to do when they actually started to make computers is calculations with numbers. For example, calculating the factorial of a number. And how would you do that? Well, in a computation, in an algorithm, what you do is that you have a series of instructions, a finite set of instructions that you can just follow using possibly a pen and paper. You can just follow the rules, and this will give you the answer. So for example, to calculate the factorial, you would start with 1, and then you will multiply it by n, and then by n minus 1, and then etc., etc., until you have arrived at n equal 1, and then you stop, and then the result that you've had that you have at the end is the product of all integers between 1 and n. Okay, so that's a simple example of a computation. The question is, and the question that scientists like Alan Turing or John von Neumann had to ask themselves is, how can you implement that physically? And to implement that physically, there's a very key element that you will find in the works of Turing and von Neumann in particular, is that these computational states which hold symbols, they must be stable. That is, between calculations, they should not change. There should be some kind of memory of those states. So, for example, the computational variable n, which is decreased by 1 every time I go through instruction 3, well, this should not change. Whatever physical state encodes it, this should not change until the next time when I have to read the number and do the calculation. Because if this was done in some physical state that was changing, which is the case of many physical systems, in fact, because of entropy, if this was the case, if there was a drift, there's no way you could implement a robust computation or a computation at all there. This is the implication that is used when you describe a computation, and this is in fact what is implied when defining what a computation is. We say that it is something that you can do using just a piece of paper and a pen. The paper here has this very important role that you can put some computational variables there and it will stay there unchanged until you actually read it and want to change it. So this is what people like Alan Turing wanted to implement in his theoretical model with the tape. There is a tape that holds the computational variables. And same with von Neumann with vacuum tubes. Now, in practice,
Roman,
yes.
sorry, I just want to tell you that you have approximately 10 minutes.
Okay.
So just to keep time. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, I hope, yeah, fine. So how did people actually make computers? There is something actually very interesting in the philosophy of mind and philosophy of cognition is that people have wondered how to define computation in a way that is not trivial, that does not make anything in the world a sort of computer, like that does not make the solar system a computer or rock implement a computation. Turns out that these philosophers have found this very difficult to do, to the extent that some people today state that computation or to compute is just a perspective. It's not actually a property of things, it's perspective. Now, when you think about it, that's very ironic because people like Alan Turing and John von Neumann, well, for them, it was not so trivial to make, to actually build a computer. You could not just take a rock and say that this is a computer. So what did they have to do? Well, if you look at very old pioneering work on computing machines like Babbage's difference engine in the 19th century, what he used at the time was mechanics, so gears typically. And what you have with mechanics is that the elements are stable. Once you have turned the gear, it does not change. It has some a number of stable positions, and mechanical elements are stable. So that can play the role of computational states. But in the modern computer, which uses electronics, you cannot do that anymore because electricity is not stable at all. You take a capacitor, for example, on any circuit with a capacitor and a resistor, it is not stable. In a few milliseconds, typically, the charge goes in the capacitor and goes out and so on. So you have to build stable states out of a physical system which itself is not stable. And the way it's done in modern computer is with the flip-flop circuit. You have transistors that are put in such a way in a circuit which has two stable states, so that it can be flipped from one stable state to another one. But the electrons themselves are not stable. So this is a feature that has to be built into the electronic device. This is what von Neumann described, and the features that had to be there in order to be able to actually implement calculations. Now, the question now is it something that corresponds to what humans do? And the answer is clearly no. Neural activity is not a computational state in the sense there is nothing stable in the activity of a neuron. The activity of a neuron is intrinsically fluctuating. Sometimes you have an action potentials, and most of the time you have what appears as some noisy activity, but that is not really noise, it's just the result of the impact of other neurons coupled with that neuron. And what the electrical spike that you see here are interactions between living entities. You will not find any computational state in the sense of a stable formal state there at the level of a single neuron. You find it in the model of Michael-Hempitz only because it has been made so, because by construction, by choice, in order to fit the symbolic view of mind, they discarded time entirely. And once you discard time, well, there's just zeros and ones, and then you have just two states. And so this is by construction, modeling construction, and not to mimic a feature that is in the brain. That feature does not exist. The neurons do not compute. Now, there is a related concept that is very much used in neuroscience, which is the concept of code. In describing neural activity as computation, what you need to do is say that the activity of a neuron encodes a computational state. And this you will see in the literature, at least explicitly from the 1960s, but even in the works of Adrian in the 1920s and 30s, at least in writing. And what is claimed is that the activity of neurons can be conceived as some sort of hieroglyphs that you can read and write. And in terms of the computational view of mind, it means that those are symbols for computational state in computations. And this is a very important aspect of the computational, neurocomputational view of brains. You find it in virtually every other neuroscientific paper in one form or another. For example, in this paper, scientists have been showing images of movies to people while measuring brain activity, and they found that different areas in the brain are more or less active depending on the different scenes, words that are being said and so on, so that there is an encoding of meaning on the brain. What that means really is that there is a mapping from the activity of some brain region to some symbol. Now, the fundamental conceptual problem with the very idea of a code, which make it irremediably flawed conceptually, is that a code is an observer's interpretation. It's not, by construction, something that exists in the brain. It's something that the observer makes to bridge a domain of measurements that he makes to a formal domain that is in the mind of the observer. So it's just a mapping from activity, number of spikes, and so on, to some symbol. Now, the problem with that is that the same measurement can be made consistent with an infinity of codes. because those codes are interpretations. So suppose, for example, you're a scientist interested in how things like numbers are represented in the brain. And so you show a sequence of numbers to the subject, and you find that there are different neurons that light up when those different numbers are shown. Then you will say, well, those neurons encode the numbers. So the blue neurons here encode 1, and the orange neurons encode 2, and so on. And that is because in your experiments, you have this correlation between, indeed, the activity of those neurons and those integers. But a different scientist interested in other aspects of cognition, for example, prediction, could be doing the very same experiment with a different question. He would show a sequence of numbers, and then he would find that, well, when the neuron blue is active, it actually predicts the next number, which is 2. So what this neuron is doing is encoding a prediction of the next number in the sequence. And this is the case also of the orange neuron, which encodes the next number. Now, you could be also scientists interested in memory. If you're interested in memory, then you might believe that some neurons encode memories, and perhaps some neurons encode the memory of the previous integer. And how do you prove that? Well, you show that there are numbers, for example, this orange number, which lights up when the number 1 was previously presented. So it has remembered the number 1. Now, the problem is that, as I said, a code is just an interpretation of activity that is measured by the observer. And as such, it is almost entirely meaningless because it depends on what the observer is interested in. It cannot give any fundamental insight on how the brain works. The reason is very simple, in fact. In a lot of the neuroscience literature, people are looking at correlates between neural activity and various aspects of task or stimuli and so on. But those are just correlates, and conclusions are taken, even though at no point is taken into consideration what the activity of the neurons actually does, what system the neurons are embedded in. Now, there is a known solution to that, although it's a difficult solution, which is that instead of looking at correlates of neural activity, and neural activity correlates with many things. For example, any function of what you think it correlates with, okay? So instead of looking at correlates, you need to look at what neural activity contributes at a behavioral scale. But if you do that, then you have to take a very different approach, which is not reductionist, that is looking at one piece of the brain and wondering what is encoding as symbols, but a systemic approach which takes the entire brain in the organism, connected to the environment, and wonders about the relative role of this connected component in the organization. Now, one might wonder, why is it that scientists have taken so much inspiration in engineering? I mean, if you think about it, the brain, nervous systems have been consistently likened to things in engineering like telegraphs, hydraulic engines, computers over centuries. Whereas in other domains, people have been using all sorts of analogies. Well, there is one simple and reasonable, in fact, reason is that when you try to understand something that you don't understand, one useful way is to take inspiration from a domain that you understand. And in the case of the mind, people have used engineering because engineering devices are objects that we understand because we have built them. And it is the only objects that we understand that are goal-driven. And this is what you want to explain about life and about cognition, how to explain goals, in fact. The problem with that inspiration is that in the case of machines, of engineering devices, the goals are whatever goals have been put there by the maker. And it follows that this analogy can never explain where goals come from in the first place. It cannot explain why biological organisms have goals, because it presupposes goals. Machines presupposes goals. A computation presupposes that there is a goal, which is the thing to be computed. So thinking of what the brain does as computation can never explain how brains have goals in the first place. So what is cognitive about brains? In cognitivism, traditionally, it is said that cognition is computation. That cannot be the case. Computation is one cognitive activity, in particular, one cognitive activity that human adults do, although not all adults. But what is specific of cognition more broadly is anticipation. You have anticipation in computation because you want to compute something. That is what you anticipate, the result. But more broadly, cognition in life, in brains, but also more broadly in biological organisms, is about anticipating, doing stuff that might be useful in the future. And where does that come from? In fact, we have a good idea where it comes from when we look at the literature in theoretical biology and not in computer science. And anticipation is rooted in the circular organization of life that I mentioned at the beginning. And the reason is that, as I said, a living organism is a very particular object that maintains itself running in out of thermodynamical equilibrium, maintains itself running in a certain way through the organization of its processes. And it means that the processes are organized in such a way that what is produced by one process will serve in the future to the continuation of the same processes. So intrinsically, the organization of life is anticipatory. The notion of goals is rooted in this anticipatory organization, where, if you wish, the fundamental goal is to survive. So I think I'm at the end of my time now. So thank you for your attention. I will take questions. And I wanted to briefly mention that I have just finished writing a book about those questions that should be published next year by Princeton University Press. So keep in touch. And here are the three, I think, most important papers I've written on the subject that some people might be interested in. Thank you.
Thank you, Roman. Applauses, digital applauses to a very encompassing talk, touching upon multiple sciences. And actually what I want to draw attention of all the listeners now in the audience is how important for profound understanding of the world we live in and who we are in it is not siloing the sciences and not isolation of sciences, but actually working across different sciences to understand, provide insights and understand better. That runs in the previous conversation that we had under VOILA, Ben Green, who is a STEM scientist and computer scientist, was talking about the importance of social scientists working together with them to apply AI and implement. In case of Roman, we see how important perspective of biology that has been omitted for a while in understanding of the brain, and now it actually is relevant for AI as well, and thinking how we can take further whether computation is a useful guideline or not. So thanks again, Roman. I would say we maybe have a couple of questions from the audience or comments. And then we proceed to the discussants. So I see there is something starting to arrive. I think everybody's thinking. So Philip Novicki, if you are there, please unmute yourself, or I can read your question.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. And my question is about just like, I guess the last slide, which is, so you said that that like cognition is not computation, but like we can basically talk about cognition as anticipation. And so then, you know, like, can we just represent anticipation mathematically, and then like, you know, which is, you know, like some form of computation, and like it aligns with the computational field?
The question is, can you understand anticipation computationally, or is that?
Yeah, just like, yeah, it basically can, so you can describe anticipation as like a form of cognition mathematically, right?
You're talking about the question of formalism, basically, right? What kind of formalism can...
No, I'm just like simply saying that anticipation is like cognition that we can like mathematically describe, right? So like, let's say like if I expect something, like let's say like with the numbers you provided with the example. So if I see 1, then it will follow that like my brain regions will fire such that I will see 2, and I can just like encode that mathematically, like in its simplest level. So can I then like, just following from what you're saying, if you, so what I'm saying is that like basically if you say that cognition is not computation, where computation is like the highest level of abstraction, and you change it with like something more concrete, which is anticipation, there is always a way to say that like something more abstract as computation can explain anticipation. And so I'm saying, if you're saying like cognition is about anticipation, can you still represent anticipation computationally and then resolve the conflict that you have with like the computation?
I see. Yeah, that's a great question. So it's a great question because lately in neuroscience theory, I think of the popular themes has been the idea that the brain is a sort of prediction machine. Okay, but the problem with that is that it's precisely that it has been understood computationally in terms of codes and so on. Now, the problem is that when you try to formalize that, and people have tried to formalize that, what people have tried to do is to say that, well, there are some neurons that predict. So it's with the identification of anticipation as prediction, which, as I will argue, is a bad identification. Right. So people would say neurons predict. And what does it mean neurons predict? A neuron doesn't speak, right? You have to make it speak somehow. The way you make it speak is by saying there is a mapping from the activity of this neuron to some symbol which represents, for example, the S integer. But again, the conceptual problem with this framework is that this mapping you come up with, but you can come up with a completely different mapping. For example, you could say that take the solar system. Well, the position of a planet predicts its future position in 1 year, because from the position of the planet, well, you can map it to the position a year ahead. This is something that the observer does. It's not something that is embodied in the organism. So there's a problem there conceptually with this idea, which arises as soon as you want to frame prediction or anticipation in computational in a computational way. That is, you need to identify neural activity with some symbol. The problem is the symbols are not in the activity. You have to come up with it. Now, the second problem is with the identification between prediction and anticipation. Anticipation is much broader than prediction. A prediction is something that you say about future events. Okay. Now, in many cases, what you want to do is not exactly predict future events. You can do this in order to anticipate, but anticipation is not really about that. So, for example,
let's say that you take your umbrella. You look at clouds and you think, well, it might be raining and you don't want to get wet. So you take your umbrella. So you have anticipated rain. The anticipation here is the action that you make in order not to get wet. So what is the prediction here? In fact, there are many predictions that you can make. One prediction is that it will rain. This might not happen, actually. The prediction might be that you will get wet. But if that is the case, then a successful anticipation is when your prediction fails, okay? It's when you take your umbrella and you do not get wet. So there's a problem with confusing prediction and anticipation, which is that predictions belong to the socio-linguistic domain. They do not belong to the domain of actions, which is what is useful for an organism, what an organism does. What an organism does is prepare for some potential events.
Sorry, Roman, if you can wrap up the answer to the question, because we have two discussants still, they need to intervene. So please.
So it's a complicated question, but my brief answer to that is that the identification of anticipation with prediction is precisely the mistake that computationalists do when they try to think about anticipation.
Indeed, that's a very important elaboration. So now I will give this floor to Ingrid Betus. Ingrid, please unmute yourself, and if you need to share any slides or anything, let us know. Thank you.
Sorry. Okay, so thank you very much for your talk. So it was very interesting because so you had very specific biology points, and actually to just dismantle all the computational theory that we got. So it was quite interesting, and I would like to go back. I was entirely agree with all the point that you mentioned. Something interesting that I would like to mention is about when you say a code. So it was I didn't mark the number of your slide, but so you mentioned the fact that a code is an observer interpretation, and as you said, yes, in this slide. So for me, it was like a reverberation with that we name in neurobiology the engram, where people were able to tackle some cell firing during an encoding memory. And so it was Tonegawa group in United States. And so with the tools that we got, the virus tools, they were able to tackle specific cell activated during an encoding. So that means an animal was inside a Skinner box, and he was supposed to do an association between a stimulus and food shock. And it was exactly the same neurons which were reactivated when you replace the animals. Is a conditioning when you replace the animal in the same box, okay, without any food shock. So that means they interpret that such as an engram, and the idea behind is, okay, so maybe the same neuron will be reactivated for to remind this. So I think so. This is an observer, as you said, and we can observe this neuron. Unfortunately, it can be easily the case when the network is always the same. But so, as you mentioned, also the problem is in terms of evolution. So we know that this engram is moving across the brain also, and that could be difficult to tackle. But my question behind is, what do you mean by neural coding analysis ignore what the activity actually does? I would like to ask you, what do you mean by activity actually does?
Okay, yeah, thank you. So in most studies about neural codes, what is typically done, not always, but what is typically done is to look at correlates between some stimulus or some aspect of the task and the activity of some neurons, right? So what is called a code is just that, just the correspondence between two things. That is independent of whether the neuron is actually in the brain at all. You could do this with anything, right? That's important when we talk about perception, because when we talk about perception, what is the role of some neurons lighting up in forming the perception? This kind of analysis do not say much about that. All they say is that usually during the normal perception, or in fact, in practice, during this experiment, usually those neurons are active. That's all that we can say. That doesn't tell us anything about what the experience is. I mean, what the contribution of the neuron is in that experience, or not even talking about experience, which raises some difficult questions, but about behavior. Even for that, if you just look at correlations between neural activities and stimuli, it doesn't tell you anything about what this neurons contributes to in terms of behavior, right? That's what I meant by ignore what the activity actually does. Of course, it is often, sometimes associated with other kinds of analysis that go a bit further, but the neural coding part itself is, I think, it's very misleading to call it a code, because it's a code for the observer. It's just a registration of some correlates that the observer sees. Does that answer?
I see that I see your point of view, but so if you are silencing this neuron, and you see that you don't have anymore your behavior, in this case, could you say that they encode, or they are the code of something?
Well, you could say that this neuron is apparently important for this experience.
Okay,
but why does it need to be a symbol?
Sure. That's a good point. Another important thing for me was when you were talking about connectome, and I agree with you that unfortunately the connectome didn't reveal all the things, because structural connection unfortunately don't say so much thing on the functional connectivity. I mean, it depends, because something that I would like to add also is, what do you think? Because so you were talking about the neuron and the firing rate of the neuron, and as you said, most of the time people consider like a 0-1, but so we have something very interesting in the brain, which is for me like a reverberation, I would say, is that we label the oscillation that you can record from the EEG. And I guess that this oscillation, so far is very difficult to take in account in a computational model. So, and I think is quite important, difficult to analyze also, and difficult to predict. But so what? And I've seen in the chat also that something, and the question related to EEG also. So maybe is connected to this question.
Yes, oscillations. Yeah, indeed. In fact, oscillations are a very good example. This is something that people have been observing for a very long time. Oscillations in electrophysiology measurements. But if you look at the computational literature, this is something that essentially doesn't exist, because it doesn't fit well at all with the idea of an algorithm. So computationalists, and there I include connectionists, typically consider that oscillations are a byproduct of the activity of the brain, but that is functionally irrelevant. That is what connectionists would do. But this is more a postulate than something that is derived from empirical discovery. In reality, there is a lot of literature, I believe, that seems to implicate oscillations in cognitive processes. And the reason why it cannot easily be fitted with computationalism is that oscillations requires a dynamical perspective on brain function and not an algorithmic perspective. The difference is that in an algorithm, time does not exist. There is iteration. That is precisely what differentiates dynamics from iterations, is that if you take an algorithm and you run it twice slower, it is the same algorithm and it will do the exact same thing. That is what is in the definition of an algorithm, is that it only depends on this formal specification independently of time. And by time, I mean real time, not the time of the algorithm. But in an actual physical systems, and especially in a distributed system, time is actually really important. You cannot have interaction between neurons if time is neglected. And once you realize that it makes complete sense, well, it makes complete sense. At least oscillations make more sense in this context when you realize that neurons have to interact with each other in the real world, the world where there is physical time and not just discrete iterations. And so yeah, I got lost a bit. But
yeah, no, I totally agree with you. But so I'm working with some people who are present here probably, and so we are building some heterogeneous model where we got some oscillation. So that means some continuous data combined with the discrete data, and so I know that is possible. So not from the some mathematical and are able to do it. So they can take this time in account now in the new model. And
so you have to distinguish between models which are mathematical and can be run on a computer, and computational models of the mind. That's not the same thing, right? For example, the biophysical models, you can like Hodgkin-Huxley and so on, you can very well run them with algorithms on a computer, but it's not algorithms of the brains. It's actually Runge-Kutta algorithm and numerical algorithm, which do not exist in the brain, right? But the models are not algorithmic models. Biophysical model is not an algorithmic model.
I'm not an expert in mathematics, but I'm sure that people who are here could reply to my place. And I'm not so convinced that you don't have algorithm model of timing. I don't know if some people want to take it.
I suppose we need to be a bit more specific about what model you're talking about there. But dynamical models like most spiking models, biophysical models, they are not algorithmic models.
Okay, this one I agree. Yeah. So maybe yes. Sorry, Katerina, you would like to give the floor to Simone maybe, so to have because the time is flying.
Yes, indeed. But you are raising important points. That's why I hate to be the time police. So Ingrid, if you have some point that you just want to pause it there, something that you had maybe in the list, you can do that, and then I move to Simone if it's okay with you.
But I don't know, because if you if we have to interrupt at 30, so it's few minutes for Simon, so I don't want to keep the
That's all right. That's all right. Go
to
ahead.
monopolize. No, that's fine. That's fine. You can we can come back after.
Okay.
I have more questions. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you, Ingrid, for your intervention and actually
You're
discussion that touched upon the previous questions that we had in the chat. To those who post in the chat, I saved the chat, so I will forward that to Roman with those who post, with the contacts who posted that. Maybe you can engage in discussion. So thanks. We might also return to questions from the chat and from the audience if you stay after, and if Roman agrees to a bit longer to stay with us. So Simone, please, the floor is yours. You also have your points, and then we move to the questions from the audience.
Thanks a lot, Ekaterina. I'll try to be as quick as possible because indeed the discussion is or turn into a debate between very in-depth experts, and I'm certainly not. But three premises. Once, so Ekaterina, you masterfully managed the session, but you did not say who you are. So just briefly, Ekaterina just joined the steering committee organizing VOILA and she's a research fellow working on the economics of artificial intelligence. I hope you don't mind that I introduced you.
Oh, thank you, sorry.
So good, you deserve as a chair also to be mentioned. Second, so this was a great talk, also for social scientists, because indeed, then I mean we can discuss whether some type of models and to what extent the computation or non-computation debate goes on. But the take-home message is that we should avoid falling into easy metaphors, let's say, because that steers then also the development of technology or what we can do. I am very also happy to see that the half-life time of proteins in the brain, at least for mice, is very short, because I have a big excuse for forgetting things now. And also I wanted to mention that I think this type of talks are very useful also to, let's say, move away TED Talks and welcome VOILA seminars, because we can also bring back some of the reflections that exist since a long time. For example, the very person that introduced the idea of modern computation in abstract terms, so Alan Turing, we also know that he wrote the chemical basis of morphogenesis, which somehow has a biological also understanding of how activators and inhibitors produce certain biological effects. So you have this combination of computation and the biology that maybe we want to rediscover. My comments are the following. First, I very much agree with not dismissing the idea of computation, but to putting computing at its place, let's say, also historically. I'm reading just right now a very short book of the philosopher of science, Lorraine Duston, which is called Rules, and somehow she suggested that even though algorithms and the idea of computing exist and is put in practice since centuries, it's only since the mid of 19th century that becomes an explosive use of idea of computation, mostly because of the political economy behind the Industrial Revolution. So there are social vested interest in building an idea that computing is what everything does. And it's also very interesting for an economist, because many economists tend to see the market as a computing mechanism. So given enough information, the market in a decentralized way will equilibrate the system through the price system. That's not the case. So there is a branch of economics which is called evolutionary economics that say the economy is like biology, it evolves, is out of equilibrium, and maybe we should look at multi-layered ecosystems of individual firms, industries, and so on to understand where the economy goes. So this goes in this direction. And but finally, the question that so we have this idea that we might complexify the debate a little bit, could be useful. My point, though, related to VOILA, given that we talk mostly about artificial intelligence and where it goes, and also beyond computing and computational sciences or neurobiology, the idea is that is this talk somehow suggesting that or put a tombstone on the idea that AGI is achievable, because we discussed last week on another VOILA on the fact that existential risk and artificial general superintelligence is often a BS, where BS stands for very academically bullshit, and somehow your argument taps into that. Like we at the moment, AI just emulates intelligence. It can't replicate it exactly because brains are not just computing as computers do. And the final thing is that, is there any way in which the metaphor is useful? So for example, in this talk, we have colleagues that works on neuromorphic chips, and there the idea of neuromorphic is not very much to copy computers, but the fact that the neural structure of artificial neural network is reproduced in analog devices. And that maybe helps them to advance this field because it, let's say, competes with classic von Neumann machines and so on and so forth when we talk about hardware. So maybe it can also be, in some respects, useful, if not overused or overexploited. That's my discussion.
A lot of questions, but okay. So maybe quickly on the neuromorphic aspects. Well, if you look at the history of computers, it's entirely neuromorphic from the start. But of course, by neuromorphic, we should simply say biologically inspired. Some inspiration has been taken from the brain, but without necessarily trying to model what the brain is doing exactly, but just taking here and there some features that might seem interesting. So for example, in the building of the computers, in fact, in von Neumann's paper, he talks about the binary neuron model of McCulloch and Pitts, and he talks about the questions of synchrony and so on. He definitely was inspired by this work to build his computer. That is for sure. So now when we talk about neuromorphic engineering or computers in modern times, well, people look at some other features that are interesting in brains, and typically one of those features is the energy consumption, the fact that a brain consumes something like 20 watts, which is much less than anything we can do with artificial models. So there is indeed some inspiration that can be taken there. So for sure, there is inspiration to be found in biology in general, and this has been the case in engineering, in many domains of engineering, in fact. So there's no reason to restrict ourselves. Okay, AGI. Okay, artificial general intelligence. I mean, I'm not going to say anything very original here. Many other people have pointed out that the debate on AGI is poorly posed because it is placing on a continuum things that belong to completely different domains. So a few years ago, like maybe up to 10 years ago, these techniques, in fact, sometimes the same techniques that I call now artificial intelligence, were called statistical learning. Okay, different terminology, but that doesn't really evoke the idea of some anthropomorphic agent that is going to rule the world, right? It's just a complicated regression line. Now it's called artificial intelligence. I mean, for various reasons. I mean, the terminology dates back, is not completely new, but part of it is for marketing reason. Let's be honest about it, and another part is anthropomorphization of algorithms. One thing about the fear of AGI, like it's going to rule the world or whatever, is specifically about these algorithms becoming agent. But the thing is that At this point, no algorithms, even the most sophisticated one, is an agent at all. So there is no continuum there. If an algorithm is going to be an agent with its own goals and so on, it will have to be through completely different means. So that implies that there is no indication in current technology that this is coming anytime soon. I'm not saying that it's impossible, but it won't be a continuation of what is currently being done. Okay, so I think other people have said that before me. Related to my talk, I think the important point here is that when we take inspiration in engineering, we do that because engineering devices have goals, but those goals are there precisely because we have put them there. A calculating machine computes something that we have asked it to do. And if you just take a bunch of transistors, put them together, it doesn't compute anything, but it does something, just not something with a goal. And the goal is not in the machine, it's us. So at this moment, we have no engineering device with their own goals, which would be something like what people fantasize as AGI. So, then the third point, which I think is very interesting, is the relation with economic theory. Indeed, in economic theory, especially in modern economic theory, neoclassical theories and so on, there is indeed also in the work of Hayek, he very explicitly talks about information processing and so on. There's the idea of the rational agent. And so these ideas are very present in modern economic theory, especially the idea of the efficiency of markets and so on. So I think it's very important to understand that these ideas of information and computing and so on have been imported somehow from also mind studies in part, or philosophy of mind and so on, but it is precisely the magic features of the brain studies that have been imported there. But how is it, for example, that the activity of a neuron is information? What I see is just some light blinking when I show some stimulus. At no point in these methodologies do we explain how this is information for the brain. In fact, the concept of information that are used in neuroscience do not address anything useful about information that could be of some use in social sciences, I think. So there's a lot of confusion here in economics and also to some extent in philosophy by taking as discoveries things which are actually presuppositions in the back of the mind of neuroscientists or cognitive scientists. At no point have scientists proved that neurons compute or encode or things like that. It's just ways of speaking and of thinking of how the brains work, but it's not discoveries. So this should not be imported as such. This should be actually criticized and looked at. In the case of economics, my view, I wrote a short piece about this on my blog, in fact. The ideas that are behind the Homo economicus are really absurd foundations for a model. The idea of the rational agent is something like a semi-god, which basically, well, it's a model of anticipation. It's interesting because I talked about anticipation at the very end. But the model of anticipation that is used in classical economics seems very magic, in fact, is that people are supposed to know everything there is to know about the world to have, there can be some probabilistic uncertainty, but people have a complete model of the world just there. You can just calculate expectations and so on, and that's it. But none of that explains, this framework cannot explain how we learn, how we get information from the world, and how do you construct the model? This cannot be explained in this way. In the same way as you cannot explain how we perceive by saying that neurons encode, you cannot explain how people anticipate by just saying that stuff is related to some future stuff. That is not a model of anticipation. It doesn't explain anything. So in reality, the way human agents inform themselves is by interaction with the world, and in economics that implies the social world. And that implies in particular that information is a notion, especially in an economic context, is a notion that is really social. It's not some magic belief that is kind of diffusing in your brain. It's something that you have to acquire by interacting. You have sources of information, or you have actions that you make in the world that tell you something about what the world is. That you have to act in the world in order to construct information. Right? I think these are important concepts that go well beyond brain studies.
I think so, but fully agree.
Indeed, we come from, me and Simone, we come from evolutionary economics. For quite a lot of time, we try to, not only us, but our community tries to actually complexify the notion of knowledge and interaction,
Right.
distributed nature of it, and how the information in the end is encoded in also social interactions. So I think we can start wrapping up here. I really am sorry to interrupt such a wonderful and multidisciplinary discussion. I enormously enjoy it. So thanks, Roman, Ingrid, and Simone, and everybody who posted questions in the chat. We might also even make at some point a follow-up, if Roman agrees, of this discussion and these topics, because we opened up so many tabs, and now we will have to somehow come to completion of them. So I once again promise those who posted questions to convey these questions and comments posted to the speaker of today and share it with also discussants, whoever wants to chime in. And now I would like to once again thank everybody who stayed with us. It's indeed almost 2 hours full. So I would like to share my slides. Romain, if you can just allow me doing that. Yes, perfect. Thanks so much. Just briefly before, in the chat, I posted a link to Margaret Boden's piece, like very accessible writing about lack of goal setting and goal seeking behavior in AI and robots, simply because they can't care less. So whoever wants to read it, please. Margaret Boden is a renowned scientist in University of Sussex. So whoever, please follow the link. And our next VOILA will be on 2nd of April, the same time slot. Our speaker is from OECD, Leah Samek. We do not yet have the title, but her research interest in intangible assets, innovation, productivity nexus, and digital transformation in AI. So please follow the website of VOILA. We have also YouTube channel where this also session will be posted. And for PhDs who attend, from the next session onwards, attendance of this VOILA seminars will count as official training. So, and follow VOILA, follow FLIA, and thanks everybody for being with us today. Thanks again. Have a nice evening.
Thank you so much for the invitation.
Thank you.
And thank you for the talk.
Thank you.